Good morning, everybody. I would encourage you to open up in your Bibles to Ecclesiastes chapter 5. That's where we're going to be at in just a second. Ecclesiastes chapter 5, and after you've done that, I would also ask you to open up your checkbooks. I got everyone's attention with that comment. We are going to be talking about your finances today, which is always fun. It's just such an exciting topic to talk about publicly. It seems so invasive. It seems so personal. And so we're just going to get it all out here this morning in the open and talk about it. We're actually going to talk about what Solomon says about your finances. Not what I say about it, but what Solomon says about your finances. This is one of those subjects that I always tend to shy away from. Every preacher has a couple that they kind of get iffy about. They just don't enjoy talking about them. But in order to discuss the whole counsel of God, we obviously have to discuss about every subject more or less under the sun. And despite what we may think, the Bible actually has quite a bit to say about how we spend our money. And I'm here to tell you right now that how you spend your money is up to you. I'm not going to be going through your individual checkbooks. If you have a checkbook, I'm not going to be doing that. I'm not going to be going through your bank accounts. What we're going to be talking about today is some principles I think that the Bible teaches about how to spend our money. We talk, you can look at different financial gurus and you can read what maybe Dave Ramsey has to say. You can even read what Tony Robbins has to say about money. And you can look at what a lot of people have to say about money. But it all comes back to very application type stuff. And that's what a lot of people tend to focus on. They say make sure you max out your 401k. They say make sure that you have a health savings account if you need something like that. Make sure your insurance premiums are paid out annually instead of monthly because you can save some money. Those types of stuff. But what none of them really ever talk about, and what Solomon talks about quite a bit, is the principles behind that. Solomon is obviously uniquely qualified to talk about money since he is both the richest man that has ever walked the face of the earth, as well as arguably the wisest man to walk the face of the earth. That's something that is talked about there in 1 Kings chapter 3. And so it puts him in kind of an interesting position, not just to talk about money and how to spend your money, but also, more importantly, the why we spend our money. And you can see a little bit of this in Ecclesiastes chapter 5, starting verse 8. I would encourage you to look at that real quick as we begin. Ecclesiastes chapter 5, starting in verse 8, he says, "If you see oppression of the poor and denial of justice and righteousness in the province, do not be shocked at the sight. For one official watches over another official, there are higher officials over them. After all, a king who cultivates the field is an advantage to the land. He who loves money will not be satisfied with money," verse 10, "nor he who loves abundance with its income. This too is vanity. When good things increase, those who consume them also increase. So what is the advantage to their owners except to look on?" That's a statement that he'll make a few times in this book. "The sleep of the working man is pleasant, whether he eats little or much, but the full stomach of the rich man doesn't allow him to sleep. There's a grievous evil which I have seen under the sun, riches being hoarded by their owner to his hurt. And when those riches were lost through a bad investment, and he had fathered a son, then there was nothing to support him. As he had come naked from his mother's womb, so will he return as he came. He will take nothing from the fruit of his labor that he can carry in his hand. This also is a grievous evil. Exactly as a man is born, thus will he die. So what is the advantage to him who toils for the wind? Throughout his life he also eats in darkness with great vexation, sickness and anger." You can just feel the optimism dripping off of Solomon's tongue. "Here's what I have seen to be good," verse 18, "and fitting, to eat, to drink, and enjoy oneself in all one's labor which he toils under the sun during the few years of his life which God has given him, for this is his reward. Furthermore, as for every man to whom God has given riches and wealth, he has also empowered him to eat from them and to receive his reward and rejoice in his labor, for this is the gift of God. For he will not often consider the years of his life," verse 20, "because God keeps him occupied with the gladness of his heart." Ecclesiastes kind of gets a bad rap sometimes because it seems so pessimistic. I mean, when he starts using words like vexation, when he starts using words like trouble and sadness and death and all these different things, it almost seems as if Solomon, who was arguably worth over $2 trillion at the peak of his net worth, just kind of looks at everything and just kind of throws his hands up and says, none of this really matters after all. You know that thing that you go to work for 8 or 5 days a week? And I do, by the way, actually do 5 days a week, in case you're wondering. But that thing you go to for 5 days a week, 40 hours a week, that thing that you spend most of your waking time doing, not really that important. As a matter of fact, it would be better if instead of focusing on that, Solomon says, you focused on your home life. So why not, instead of spending 40 plus hours at work, why don't you just sit at home, watch Netflix, hang out with your kids, farm your land, do that kind of stuff? That seems remarkably pessimistic and exactly the opposite of what so much of the world wants us to believe. But even contained here in Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verses verses 8 through 20, there are 4 principles, and we're just going to shoot through these very quickly. This is not the meat of the lesson, but there's 4 principles that he brings out in these verses that I think are worth highlighting. The first one being, in these first couple of verses, with great power comes great responsibility. Yes, I stole that from Spider-Man, but that is also something that Solomon talks about in the first couple of verses. If you are blessed with an extraordinary amount of wealth, or any kind of wealth, the responsibility is for you to exercise that using an immense amount of discretion. You have people that depend on you, you have people that rely on you, you have people that you can help, and so with great power, as Uncle Ben from Spider-Man would say, comes great responsibility. Number 2, the pursuit of wealth never ends. This is probably one of the most poignant statements in the entire book of Ecclesiastes, as he goes on and on and on, at least in this section, about the fact that if you love oil and wine, if you love pleasure, if you love joy, there will never be an end to this. We'll talk about this a little bit more throughout the course of this lesson, but there will never be an end to these things. If you get $1 million, you want 10 million. If you want to have $1 billion, you want 10 billion. We're all, after all, trying to be Jeff Bezos, not the Jeff Bezos that goes to space, but the Jeff Bezos that has $180 billion. That's the dream, isn't it? Even he wakes up and still has to do something with his Monday through Saturday. But the pursuit of wealth never ends. He also mentions there in verses 8 through 20 that money doesn't stay with you. And this is one of the subtexts of the entire book, is that you pursue with your life things that will outlast your life. And if you want to focus on one thing, at least in Ecclesiastes, that's the thing to focus on, is that in order to reach maximum happiness, you have to find something that overextends throughout your life, goes past your life. Everything that we put our effort and our time into, a lot of those things will kind of burn up. Or we'll lose them at the end of our life when we pass away, this or that. But if you really want your life to be noteworthy, invest it in something that will outlast you. Money doesn't stay with you. And even if it does, who knows what the guy that inherits it is going to do with it. He also says that wealth is meant to be enjoyed now. This is probably the simplest concept in Ecclesiastes to understand, is the fact that wealth is not necessarily to be stored up to be enjoyed once you clock out of your job and your retirement, and now that you're 70 years old, now you can start living. Solomon doesn't take that attitude. The attitude that Solomon takes throughout all of his wealth is that wealth is meant to be enjoyed now. And so these are some of the principles that at least he brings up here in Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 8 through 20. If you want to know more about what he has to say throughout the book of Ecclesiastes about money, you can read the entire book. It's chock full of stuff like this. But if you really want to know what he says about money, the real place that you have to go is Proverbs. 29 chapters worth of all these different proverbs, all these different one-offs, all these different things that he says concerning money, concerning life, concerning relationships, concerning all these different things. Solomon spends an inordinate amount of time talking about cash, talking about money, talking about how you spend it. And so what we're going to do this morning is we're going to look at 5 proverbs very quickly. I told you this wasn't the meat of it. We're going to look at 5 proverbs very, very quickly. I noticed everybody got really comfortable when I said 5. 5 proverbs that Solomon says, and I make this statement in my most televangelist type of way, that if you implement them in your life, will absolutely revolutionize your finances. And I mean that in all sincerity and in all honesty. The first proverb I want to look at is Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 8. We're just going to put these up here one at a time. You can look at the context around them if you want to, because there is sometimes context that sits around that. Proverbs usually isn't written like that, though. One-off statements that he kind of makes that you can compartmentalize, that you can memorize, and move on with your life. Proverbs 16 and verse 8 simply says, "Better is a little with righteousness than great income with injustice." Now, there are 2 ways that you can look at this verse, and I've seen people that take one or the other. Both are probably right in their own respective ways. But the most obvious consideration is that it's better to have a little bit that you can have contentment with than a whole lot that all it does is give you grief and give you issues. And for some reason, when I was putting this sermon together, I thought of the mafia. I don't know why. But you have people that have these stacks of cash, but they're always turning around looking to see who's going to come up behind them. That's that mentality that I think he's going for here. But really, this is a consideration that we should all focus on. The idea of comfort at its core, ladies and gentlemen, is to provide a measure of comfort for you. The idea of money is to provide comfort for you. If you had $11 billion, chances are you're not flying coach. Chances are you've got a private jet where you can stretch out, you can take a nap, you've probably got a personal chef that makes all your food for you. There is a lot of advantages advantages to being wealthy. Not that I would know necessarily, but I would imagine there are a lot of advantages to being wealthy. But what he talks about here is that if it's done with injustice, then that discomfort you have from the way that you accumulated it, that guilt makes it null and void. That all the money in the world, all the things that you have, is all kind of goes by the wayside because you're racked by this perpetual amount of guilt. And so there are some ways that there are some people that take that's what he's talking about here in Proverbs 16 verse 8, that it matters how you acquire money. There's another way that people take it that I think is equally valid. And they say that the way that you acquire your wealth will dictate what happens to that wealth and whether or not you can further accumulate wealth. For instance, if you acquire your wealth through, and I'll just let you use your imagination here, but if you acquire your wealth through some really kind of nefarious means, then chances are it could be lost just as easily as you obtained it. Or it could be taken from you just as easily as you got it. Or you could, because you don't have good financial money management, you could squander it away just as easily. And so the way that you have money, it dictates a lot about how you keep it as well as how you produce it in the future. But I think there's another thing that he talks about here too that I think is worth looking at. Look in Genesis 13. Kind of piggyback off of this statement, the way that we create wealth. I think you see this a little bit in Genesis chapter 13. It doesn't take the Bible very long to start talking about wealthy people. And you see that very early here, but you see it ultimately in Genesis 13. The first 9 verses of this chapter are all about this disagreement that takes place between Abraham and Lot, both of whom are exceedingly wealthy. To the point that in the first 9 verses of Genesis chapter 13, you have them arguing. Their flocks and their servants and their lands are so vast, especially in Canaan, where there's not really a whole lot of people at this point. It's so vast that they intersect with each other. And your servants are fighting with his servants, and so they come to this agreement in Genesis 13. They say, what we're going to do is we're going to divide up. You go one way, I'll go the other way. And Abraham, as the example that he is, gives Lot first choice about where he wants to go. In Genesis chapter 13, starting verse 10, Lot lifted up his eyes and saw all the valley of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. This is before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. It was like the garden of the Lord. It was like the land of Egypt as you go to Zoar. And so Lot chose for himself all the valley of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled in the cities of the valley and moved his tents as far as Sodom. It's an important note. Verse 13, now the men of Sodom were wicked exceedingly and sinners against the Lord. The reason why the end of verse 12 and verse 13 is put in here is because it's letting us know that this is common knowledge at this point. It's not as if Lot is just moseying up to Sodom and Gomorrah and thinks to himself, oh, this looks like a good place, and oh, I've got these great neighbors. It was well known that Sodom and Gomorrah were exceedingly immoral. And yet Lot, there in verse 11, lifts up his eyes and sees these valleys, sees these opportunities for him to accumulate more wealth. And so he says to himself, I'm just going to throw caution to the wind. I'm going to cozy up to Sodom and Gomorrah. And he pitches his tents as far as Sodom. That's an important note. Because when you cycle back into the story a few chapters later, where is Lot? Lot is not outside the tents, or outside the walls of Sodom. He is sitting in the city gates with the other elders of the city. And that's how he encounters these angels in the first place. But then you go a couple chapters later, where do you find Lot? Lot, who puts so much emphasis not only on what he has, but also on how he can project it into the future. Where do you find Lot? The last thing that we see of him, after his wife turns into a pillar of salt, by the way, is him sitting in a cave, penniless, committing incest with his daughters while he's drunk because they think the entire world has come to an end. Now, where did all that begin? Now, you can probably put a lot of different checkpoints and you can say, well, this happened and this happened and this happened. But I want to argue, too, that it all began, at least for Lot, there in Genesis chapter 13, when he made the incredibly unwise decision to throw caution to the wind and put his finances above everything else. Shame on him for putting his daughters in that situation. Shame on him for putting his wife in that situation where she didn't even want to leave. She longed to look back at what she was leaving. Lot barely escaped Sodom and Gomorrah with his integrity. And I would be willing to bet that he would give anything to go back to that point where he made that decision and settle anywhere else than where he had. It's better to have just a little righteousness, just a little bit of wealth with righteousness and contentment that you can enjoy, because after all, that's the end product of it all, than great income with injustice, either injusticely accumulated or developed and projected into the future. Better is a little income, or better is a little with righteousness than great income with injustice. How about this one? Proverbs chapter 13 and verse 11. Wealth obtained by fraud dwindles, but the one who gathers by labor increases it. A few months ago, we all woke up, I think it was a Tuesday, to a very interesting email from Elder Cody Crumpton. We all woke up and the website had been hacked, and we talked about that. And I got this email, and I texted Cody about it. I'm like, hey, just so you know, there's this guy emailing me from eldercodycrumpton@gmail.com who I think isn't probably you, so just FYI. Well, that led into bigger discussions, and we found out everybody in the church had got that email. And this is not a scam that is unfamiliar to a lot of us. A lot of us have seen something like this. Usually they come from Nigeria for whatever reason. But we all have seen emails like this. This guy was maybe a little bit more sophisticated. I mean, he created a whole Gmail account for it. But regardless, these scams always exist. There's always these charlatans. There's always these people who think that they can skirt the process. There's people who think that I don't have to get up and go work hard for my money. I can just trick people. Or I can just go take it from somebody. Because after all, isn't that so much easier? Rather than going to a job for 40 hours a week, why don't I just steal it from other people? Create a fake email account, hack a website, and then email everybody in the church building and see if they'll send me it. That's so much easier. The problem with that, as Proverbs chapter 13 verse 11 is, and this is the one thing that provides us some consolation to that whole situation, is that eventually that wealth that obtained by fraud dwindles. The only surefire way to generate wealth or to generate income for yourself is through good old-fashioned hard work. We can't scam our way into $1 billion. Some people might, but they eventually lose it. Look at Bernie Madoff as Exhibit A. We may be able to trick and steal for a certain period of time, but inevitably those same habits that lead us towards that path will allow us to dwindle that wealth away. And so he says very simply here in Proverbs chapter 13 and verse 11, and notice just how simple this statement is, that wealth obtained by fraud dwindles, but the one who gathers by labor increases it. Look at Proverbs chapter 28 real quick. Proverbs chapter 28. We talked about how a lot of these proverbs kind of stand by themselves, and this one does to a certain extent. But in Proverbs chapter 20, I think you can see some contextual help with this idea. Proverbs chapter 28, starting in verse 18. Proverbs chapter 28, starting in verse 18. He says, he who walks blamelessly will be delivered, but he who is crooked will fall at once. Notice that juxtaposition between the righteous and the crooked, the wicked. Verse 19, he who tills his land will have plenty of food, but he who follows empty pursuits will have poverty and plenty. A faithful man will abound with blessings, but he who makes haste to be rich will not go unpunished. To show partiality is not good, because for a piece of bread a man will transgress. That shows you just how low human beings will go sometimes. Verse 22, a man with an evil eye hastens after wealth and does not know that want will eventually come upon him. He who rebukes a man will afterwards find more favor than he who flatters with the tongue. He who robs his father and his mother and says, it's not a transgression. That's the companion of a person who destroys. An arrogant man stirs up strife, but he who trusts in the Lord will prosper. He who trusts in his own heart is a fool, but he who walks wisely will be delivered. There is no shortage of people in this world, ladies and gentlemen, and we all know people like this. There is no shortage of people in this world who think that they are smarter than you when it comes to accumulating wealth. They think, well, I can't believe that you're doing this. There's a much easier way to make money. These get-rich-quick schemes, which don't even get me started on those. But these get-rich-quick schemes, these fraudulent ideas, these pyramid schemes, all these different things that people will guarantee not only that you'll become wealthy, but two, you don't even got to work for it. And yet what Solomon lays into here in Proverbs chapter 28 is the equilibrium of things. That eventually if you shortcut everything in life, those shortcuts will come back around and haunt you. That if you constantly are somebody who is trying to get out of work, if you're constantly somebody who is trying to take the easy way out, avoid confrontation, avoid labor, if you're trying to avoid those things, eventually that will come back to bite you. And so what he says very simply here in Proverbs chapter 13 and verse 11 is, wealth obtained by fraud dwindles, but one who gathers by labor increases it. I like this one though too. Proverbs chapter 21 and verse 17. He who loves pleasure will become a poor man. He who loves oil and wine will not become rich. That's exactly what we talked about in Ecclesiastes chapter 5. If you listen to nothing else in this lesson, listen to what I'm about to tell you. The genius of Solomon's approach to money, listen to this. The genius of Solomon's approach to money is that he does not view the pursuit of money as an end unto itself. Let me say that again. The genius of Solomon's approach to money is that he does not view money as an end unto itself. When you think about the reasons that a lot of us take jobs, a lot of us take promotions, a lot of us make moves in our life, a lot of it is because financial reasons. You can take a better job with an extra $50K a year, maybe some benefits, some stock options. You can take a promotion you don't want just because there's more money. So a lot of the reasons we make moves in our life are financial based. Nothing wrong with that. I'm not sitting here telling you that you need to stay in a job that you hate just because you don't need to be, quote, greedy. Make the moves that you need to make. But what I'm also telling you this morning is that a lot of jobs and a lot of things that we'll do in our life, if we're doing them only for money, we need to reevaluate our career goals. If the only reason we move halfway across the country is to take a job that promises double our salary, but we end up pitching our tents closer to Sodom, if we end up moving away from a support network, if we end up taking away from our precious family time, then those are things that need to be considered. And what he says very simply here in Proverbs chapter 21 and verse 17 is that if you love oil, if you love wine, if you love pleasure, if these are the things you're after, you will never become rich. Number one, because there's no end to those things. But number two, you will spend all your wealth trying to accumulate it. One of the saddest things about Solomon's life is not that he had all this money and all these sins, although that's certainly sad. One of the saddest things about Solomon's life is that after he had accumulated $2 trillion worth of money, had all these kids, all these wives, all the pleasures that Ecclesiastes chapter 2 talks about, the very last image that we have of his historical life is grudgingly chasing Jeroboam into the wilderness because he's trying to preserve his power. What a pathetic ending to somebody who had so much promise in life. What a sad conclusion to somebody who was blessed with so much. If the only reason we make moves and the only reason we do things is because of the financial benefits of it, then we need to reevaluate our career goals. We need to think about ourselves, what is actually most important? Is what most important this extra $30K a year? Or maybe what's most important is the fact that I get to watch my kids grow up. Maybe that's what matters. And I'm not telling you here not to take promotions. I'm not telling you not to make moves. What I am telling you here is make other considerations for why we do these things, rather than just the financial benefits. Let's take this into a spiritual narrative here real quick. If I were to do a straw poll and ask everybody to raise their hand why they're here this morning, I said, are you here for heaven? I would imagine a lot of people would say, I am here for heaven. I want to go to heaven when I die. Nothing wrong with that. But why else are you here? And this is a lot of what Jesus asks about John the Baptist. What did you go out to see? What were you after? What did you want? Why are you here this morning? Are we here for heaven? Great. Are we here to draw closer to God? Are we here for that intimacy with His people? Are we here to draw closer to Him in prayer? Are we here to solidify our integrity and our character about what it means to be a child of God? Or are we simply just biding our time Sunday after Sunday after Sunday until we die and go to heaven? Is that what we're after? Or are we showing up twice a week in this building to sharpen our souls, to build one another up? I appreciate Jay reading from us in Matthew chapter 5, verses 3 through 9. Listen to what he says here again. I love that he starts this entire Sermon on the Mount with what he talks about in this passage. Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 3. He doesn't just say, good for you for being a child of God, you'll inherit heaven. That would have been awesome. But listen to the character building that he places here in Matthew 5. Matthew 5 and verse 3, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, who show emotion for the world and for the sin, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the gentle, those people who are willing to subject themselves to keep those relationships, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who have the drive, who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they'll be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers. Notice he doesn't say peacekeepers. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. You think about what the character of a Christian is, and you can equate this with an employee if you want to, although I am not fully qualified to do that. There are other people here that can do that much better than I can. But when you think about the quality of a Christian, the quality of a Christian is not somebody who sits here as a robot and exists inside of an assembly for 70 years, dies, and goes to heaven. The character of a Christian is somebody who's always striving to get a little closer to God. It's not about heaven. It's not about always, the comfort and those things that we'll have at the end of our life. It's about the constant pursuit of what truly our makeup is about, which is righteousness. Pursuing peace with each other, building up one another, evangelism, not because we have to, but because we have a story that is so worth telling. If we love pleasure and oil and wine, we'll never become rich, because there will never be enough of that to satisfy even the most demanding soul, who will also spend it in truckloads to achieve something that will vanish just like that. Proverbs 28 verse 27, along those same lines. He who gives to the poor will never want, but he who shuts his eyes will have many curses. One of the dirty little secrets, if you can let me use that phrase, one of the dirty little secrets of money is that it's not the accumulation of that money that makes you internally happy, but the giving away of it does. There's a reason why, and I know, so I thought about this sermon a while back when Bill Gates was still married to his wife, but there was, and before all the Jeffrey Epstein stuff, but there was a time in Bill Gates' life where he stepped away from Microsoft. And allegedly under the time, the reason Bill Gates stepped away from Microsoft was because he wanted to spend more time in his charitable endeavors. And if you negate the things that he's done that made news recently, Bill Gates has actually done quite a bit in foreign countries and third world countries and building wells and education, that type of stuff. But there's a reason people like that eventually, after they accumulate so much money, go into charitable endeavors. The Giving Pledge is a perfect example of that. Anybody that has a net worth of over $1 billion can be a member of it. All you do is you make a voluntary pledge that you will give away half your wealth when you die, or by the time you die, to charities of your choice. There's a reason why billionaires do that. It's because at some point they realize that what makes them happy is not the accumulation of more money, but the giving away of it does. I guarantee you right now, if you leave today and you go to Red Lobster and you spend $50 on an amazing meal from Red Lobster, you will be satisfied for quite a while. I mean, depending on how much you order, you will be satisfied for days possibly. You take it home, little doggy bags, that's great. But if you go home today and you take that same $50 and you go on GoFundMe, and you find somebody who's in need of some kind, that will satisfy you for a lot longer. And that's the dirty little secret of money, is that it's not the accumulation of these things. It's not the accumulation of money that makes you internally happy. It's the giving away of it. When you look at somebody like Dorcas, for instance, which is my favorite name in the entire Bible. We can call her Tabitha if you want. But Dorcas has no reason whatsoever to exist in the annals of history. By all accounts, she was a simple woman in a backwards town that was neither an apostle, was not blessed with spiritual gifts, was not somebody who converted the world. She stayed in her little pocket of the universe, and she helped the people around her. And yet what happened? When she died, people showed up by droves to show what she had done for them. And I don't like to think that it was because of this, but Peter, seeing how much she meant to her, rose her from the dead. If that's not an appreciation for what she'd done, I don't know what is. That's an example that speaks volumes. And so before we think to ourselves, well, doing this will never really help us at all, talk to Dorcas. She came back from the dead because Peter was, well, I don't know if it was because, but Peter was impressed, and then she was raised from the dead. There you go. But then you think somebody on the opposite side, somebody like the rich man and Lazarus. And the only thing that's said about the rich man and Lazarus, the only thing that's said about him is that he A, ate a whole ton of food, B, dressed in purple every day, and C, stepped over Lazarus on his way to work, or whatever he was doing that day. No legacy, no knowledge of what he did, no charitable endeavors, no impact on the world, and his death is so starkly different from the way Lazarus dies. Lazarus dies and is carried away by the angels. The rich man dies and was buried. But the rich young ruler, who was so upset at the thought of losing all of his money because the only thing he was concerned about was what he was giving up instead of what he was gaining. And Jesus is very careful to point out in all three of those stories that if you give up those things, you will have treasure in heaven. He didn't care about that. The only thing he cared about was what he was giving up. So the dirty little secret of money is that it's not the accumulation of wealth. It's giving away of it. And that's why Solomon views money not as an end to itself, but as a tool. What you can do with it. Finally, I love what he says here in Proverbs 23 and verse 4. Do not weary yourself to gain wealth. Cease from your consideration of it. Is that even a proverb, by the way? Or is that just a declarative statement? I love how Solomon doesn't say, stop thinking about it. I love how he doesn't say, give less consideration. He says, do not weary yourself to gain wealth. Cease from your consideration. Full stop. Don't think about it. And when you think about the way that the Bible phrases this idea, that is so often how it's used. It's never, try to be a little less worldly. It's never try to think less about money. Over and over and over again, the biblical narrative is stop obsessing about cash. To the point that in Luke the 12th chapter, Jesus almost just brings the hammer down on his followers for their just constant pursuit of all things financial. And more importantly, there in Luke the 12th chapter, their obsession with it. Luke the 12th chapter, starting in verse 22. Luke chapter 12 and verse 22. After this argument about the guy who wants the family inheritance divided, he says in verse 22, for this reason I say to you, don't worry about your life, as to what you'll eat, nor for your body as to what you'll put on. For life is more than food, and the body is more than clothing. There's more to life than your bank account, and whether or not you share your bank account on Facebook. Consider the ravens, verse 24, for they neither sow nor reap. They have no storeroom nor barn, and yet God feeds them. How much more valuable are you than birds? And which of you, by worrying, can add a single hour to his lifespan? You can't do anything about that. Verse 26, if then you cannot do even a very little thing, why do you worry about other matters? Consider the lilies, as if we needed another metaphor, another example. Consider the lilies, how they grow. They don't toil or spin, but I tell you, not even Solomon in all his glory clothed himself like one of these. If God clothes the grass, which is alive today, tomorrow's thrown into the furnace, how much more will he clothe you, ye men of little faith? Notice how he equates obsession with money to a lack of faith. Not that we can't pay our bills, that's different, but an obsession with money with a lack of faith. Verse 29, do not seek what you will eat and what you will drink. Don't keep worrying. For all these things the nations of the world eagerly seek. Some translations would say Gentiles. But your Father knows that you need these things. Seek His kingdom. These things will then be added to you. Don't be afraid, little flock, for your Father has chosen gladly to give you the kingdom. We obsess about things, ladies and gentlemen, that quite frankly don't matter. And I am not saying here for 1 second that we don't need to worry about who's going to pay the electrical bill, because obviously God will pay it. That's not what I'm saying. But this constant pursuit, this idolization of money, there's a reason why Paul in Colossians chapter 3 verse 5 calls greed idolatry. It becomes the single-minded pursuit of everything that embodies us. And I love how Jesus in this passage says, you are more than food. You are more than clothing. You are more than money. Think back to Matthew chapter 5, those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. There's one more passage I want us to look at and then we'll finish. Look at Psalm 37. This is a psalm that has stayed with me at various times in my life just because I think it's so encouraging in so many ways. And we see examples of this in our everyday life. In Psalm 37 verse 16, this goes back to what we mentioned literally at the beginning. But in Psalm 37 and verse 16, he says, better is the little of the righteous than the abundance of the wicked. That's another verse that says exactly what we led this off with. For the arms of the wicked will be broken, but the Lord sustains the righteous. If you underline or highlight that word sustains. The Lord knows the days of the blameless, and their inheritance will be forever. They will not be ashamed in the time of evil, and in the days of famine they will have abundance. The wicked, however, verse 20, will perish. The enemies of the Lord will be like the glory of the pastures. They vanish like smoke. They vanish away. The wicked borrows and doesn't pay back, but the righteous is gracious and gives. Tell me this doesn't embody everything we've been talking about. For those blessed by him will inherit the land, but those cursed by him will be cut off. Listen to this in verse 23. The steps of a man are established by the Lord, and he delights in his way. When he falls, he will not be hurled headlong, because the Lord is the one who holds his hand. I love this verse. Verse 25. I have been young, and now I am old. Yet I have not seen the righteous forsaken or his descendants begging bread. All day long he is gracious and he lends, and his descendants are a blessing. There are a few things that the Scriptures guarantee over and over and over again, one of which is salvation. It's going to be there. We need to remember that. But one of the other things that the Scriptures over and over again guarantee is the fact that if you focus on God, He will focus on you. And you may not be the richest guy in the world. You may not be the one who is on Forbes anytime soon. You may not be flying off on the next private jet to space or whatever they're doing these days. You may not be that guy. But number one, you'll have enough that you need to get through the day. And I think in a lot of ways, God does that is through this right here, us as Christians. But number two, a fixation on what we have will give us the contentment that allows us to enjoy that a whole lot more than a lot of millionaires enjoy their cash. There are a whole lot of, I would imagine, millionaires and billionaires in the world that are some of the most unhappy people in the world. And there are some of the poorest people on the face of the earth that don't think 1 second about all the things they don't have because they're so focused on what they have. And they love it, and they're content with that. That's the reason we're so wealthy as Christians. Not because we have everything, but because we're content with what we have. We focus on the things that truly make us happy, our family, our friends, our things that we get to do in our little corner of the universe, the contentment with that. That's what makes us happy. And ultimately, we know that even though the world may fall, our future is secured with heaven. That's a contentment you can't buy, ladies and gentlemen. That's a future you can't purchase. That's something we can only have when we put our hope firmly fixated on God. And that's a hope that you can have if you need the gospel. Come now and take it as we stand and as we sing.